at the top of the hour. So if you would like to, in the chat feature today, we have Dr. Wagner with us. Claire's going to be hosting a conversation with him. Claire's the president of our IEA Great Lakes chapter, and we would love to have your questions. So if you can post those in the chat feature, we would love to have those questions in the chat, and then I'll be giving those over to Claire so we can get those to Dr. Wagner, and we'll be having as much open conversation as we can today after we share for just a little bit. But Erica, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of kick us off with some announcements, and then we'll go to Claire and Dr. Wagner.
All right. Well, as Teresa said, we're so excited that you've joined us today. We've got a great group, over 100 registered, and so we're so thankful Dr. Wagner's with us. The Great Lakes region, it really, anything that touches the Great Lakes, is part of that region, and so we're excited about some of the events that are coming up, and so I'm going to be posting in the sidebar chat for you. That way you can grab some links and things like that. But we have everything from online collaborative community, something called Enneagram circles, where Teresa McCloy that was just speaking and myself host those groups. And so it's really a place where people are able to come and find out how we can use the tool of the Enneagram in the work we do. And so it's a great monthly membership program. Connie Frecker of the Enneagram Institute of Ohio is offering an Enneagram and Relationships workshop. And so some registration information will be there in the sidebar for that. And then we've got two IEA accredited certification programs from Dr. Wagner, and in June and July, and then also from Clare Loughrige, and so who is our IEA president for the Great Lakes region. And so both of those will be available as well, but those are certification programs where you can get that higher level of learning and the certification that you may be desiring. And the last thing we'll say is we do have a conference that is on the calendar right now. We are certainly monitoring with the rest of the world what is happening with COVID-19. And so as the board meets for the GLR and also with the Minnesota chapter we're partnering with, we will get you information on that as soon as we have it. But I'm going to turn it over to Claire, and she'll introduce Dr. Wagner and get us started for the day.
Thank you, Erica and Teresa. Want to greet you all today and say this is the weirdest thing we've ever done, right? We are all in quarantine, lockdown separately, but today we get to be together. Yesterday, as I was communicating with Dr. Wagner, he was talking about being a hermit, and of course, as a 5, he loves that. And yet he also is a very harmonized individual and has this beautiful heart that we hear, and so grateful for his action in the world and all of the training he's done with so many that are on this call today. So if you would just let us know if you've been through Dr. Wagner's training on the sidebar, just say, hey, I'm one of Jerry's students. That would be really cool. And if you haven't been, you don't want to miss that opportunity to learn from one of the earliest Enneagrammers in the West. And Dr. Wagner started teaching it in Chicago in the very early days and wrote one of the first dissertations on the Enneagram for his doctorate. And so we're super grateful that we can be under his tutelage on so many occasions. Dr. Wagner is a clinical psychologist, a former Jesuit, and so we felt like we were in safe hands today to let him guide this time of global solidarity and global solitude. And so we're so grateful that you're with us today, Dr. Wagner, and we'll turn it over to you in a minute, but we're going to begin, and it might be a little bit difficult because we have ding-dong sounds coming in, but we're going to begin with a moment of silence and a beautiful poem from this book called Gorillas of Grace. And oh, how we need to be gorillas of grace right now. And we were talking over the last week about what Dr. Wagner would share. And he wants to talk about how your true self is showing up in these days. And where have you seen it? And I told some of our board members, I said, you know, I've had a lot of seeing your Enneagram slip sightings. You know, you remember that? Like your Enneagram slip is showing in these moments. It shows on Facebook, it shows in the kitchen, it shows in the grocery store. Our essential self, our true self, can emerge when we're present, when we're conscious, but we can also survive and cope by utilizing our personality to make it through these days. And so some of us are living in some very hard moments, and it is your personality that's helping you get through the day. So as a 3, honestly, that little inner supervisor gets my butt out of bed when some days I'd rather just stay there and pull the covers up over my head. And then I also have to say, okay, nope, this is a keep the covers over your head day, Claire. And so let the little 9 be in the lead. So wherever you are right now, just know that you're in a place of grace. We're going to notice things without judgment. We're not going to shame. We're not going to criticize ourselves. We're going to be in a place that is safe. You'll notice that we'll have questions in the chat and we'll be able to get to those, but know that we are recording. So anything that you say will be on the YouTube channel. So we're just asking you to only ask questions or respond to Dr. Wagner in ways that you feel comfortable, letting that be with the global, the global brother and sisterhood right now. So could you just get comfortable in your chair, wherever you are, and begin to breathe. Let your gaze soften. Maybe you can find something out the window or gently choose a spot in your own situation that feels safe to gaze upon. Maybe you want to close your eyes, but we want to invite you to breathe. Allowing the reality of your breath to remind you that you're still here. And there's a purpose for you to be here on this day. Allowing your breath and the oxygen that comes in and nourishes your organs, your systems. Just be grateful for this nourishment even now. You're taking a breath with about 100 other fellow pilgrims and people who are serious about taking an inward journey. And even as this breath goes in through the nose and down, we realize that we are alone and together. Eternal friend, grant me an ease to breathe deeply of this moment, this light, this miracle of now. Beneath the din and fury of great movements and harsh news and urgent crises, make me attentive still to good news, to small occasions, and the grace of what is possible for me to be, to do, to give, to receive, that I may miss neither my neighbor's gift nor my enemy's need. So a few more breaths here, becoming aware of the gift of this moment. And if we could just open our eyes, and when you feel ready to engage the screen, let's just say welcome to one another in whatever way you'd like to. Say welcome. And maybe a virtual hug. And thank you, Dr. Wagner, for being with us and for guiding us. I know you said you were in your cave over there in Illinois, and we know that you have ways of coping that others who are not fives know not of. And we really appreciate you saying you wanted to talk about the authentic self, and I know that you'll take your time with this, but one of the things I don't want you to forget to get into is this one question that I think you added at the very end after who is my real self. But have you confronted the delusion of separateness and experienced your union with being? And in my tradition, Catherine of Genoa used to say, my deepest me is God. And when I feel fragmented or beside myself and I need to come back home, I remember my deepest me is God. And so I wonder how you do that. You're going to talk about connecting with the authentic self and the delusion that there is a separateness. And so will you show us how to access our inner five during these cave-like days?
I'm not sure if you want to access your inner five, but after you see what it's like. Before I launch into this, I just want to say, I don't know if folks know that your mom passed away recently, so we want to kind of remember her too. What a beautiful woman she was, Jewel. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of death, but it's been around a long time, so we're all going to have to confront it. But anyway, you have our love and best wishes. It's hard these days. So thank you for doing this for us.
Thank you for doing it for us.
Yeah. Well, you're probably wondering why I called this meeting. And I gotta say, I've always enjoyed that there's a character in Moliere's play who was delighted to discover that he was speaking prose his whole life and didn't know it. And in contrast, I was horrified to discover recently that I've been talking about the real self all my life, and I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. So I'm hoping to hear from you, not so much questions as if you're willing to talk about what has been your experience of your real self. I'm gonna, because I had nothing better to do these days than read, I will, give you some ideas from what different psychologists have said, go a little bit deeper into what some Enneagram folks have said, especially Sandra Maitre, go into what Richard Rohr, Thomas Merton, David Benner has to say. So, as we're stuck here at home, or we're privileged to be at home, we have a chance to go from being called out to now being called in. And so, let's see how far down we can go. So I have been reading a lot of books just to tell you where some of this is coming from. Besides psychology books on what's the real self. Oh, I should say this too, and you probably know this. I get the false self. That's really easy to understand. So when I read books about the false self, Enneagram books or psychology books, yeah, I got it. Because the false self is very boundaried, clearly defined. It's repetitive, kind of rigid, fixed, very concrete. I read what people say about the false self and I say, yeah, I get it. I know what you're talking about. Then when they launch into the true self, it's like, what? Let me reread that again. What are you talking about? Because it gets vague, gets abstract. It's like the real self or the true self gets kind of flexible and fluid and spontaneous, doesn't have boundaries. It's kind of hard to get a hold of it. And probably we might be beyond concepts, which is, a horrible thought for a 5, but it could be. So I've been reading about, Karen Armstrong's books, The History of God, Islam, to see if Sufism has anything to say about the Enneagram or the self. It's great stuff. Rereading Richard Rohr's books, if you haven't read his books, is Agent here, Immortal Diamond, Falling Upward, Cosmic Christ, the Trinity. I've reread a collection of stuff on Merton and Sufism, because he got interested in Sufism towards the end of his life. Contemplative Prayer that he wrote, and David Benner's book on the, what is this called? The Gift of Being Yourself. It's a wonderful little book. And reread, if you haven't read it, Sandra Maitre's books, The Spiritual Dimension of the Enneagram and Virtue and Vices. So it's really interesting. So, true confession, before we begin, and because that's why I'm asking you about this. I thought I, was in touch with my true self until I realized it's probably not that often. I thought, well, maybe when I play the piano, my true self comes out. It's creative. But then I'm always kind of imagining I'm playing to an audience. Oh, there's my false self again. Or I got the idea about what it's like to experience God. I don't know that I've ever actually experienced God. I even asked a couple of friends of mine, one's a Jesuit, one's a former Jesuit like myself, have you ever had a direct experience of God? And they said, no. Now, you're probably saying, well, I'm not surprised. Why would God want to reveal himself to Jesuits and former Jesuits? But put that nasty thought out of your mind. So I'm wondering, well, maybe we experience God indirectly through people, through nature. That's the way it works. Or maybe mystics experience God directly, but not the rest of us. Or maybe all of us have it's part of our legacy or endowment. God wants us to know him or her or them. So I'm curious not to hear what your thought is about this, but what your experience is. And it's going to be tough enough to do just with our group here, but now we find out, oh hell, we're going to be on YouTube for the rest of our lives. So, whatever you want to say, but I hope you have something to say. So,
well,
yes, did you have something to say already? No.
Well,
Yes.
I always have something to say.
Yes.
So, but I can wait too. And
Okay.
I love this question. Not what you think about God, but has there been an embodied experience?
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because as I'm reading all these books about mysticism and all that, there's a little voice in my head that says, put the book down.
Mm-hmm.
You ain't going to get it by reading this book. You're not going to discover what love is by reading C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves. You got to fall in love. You need to experience God, not think about God. So yeah, so that's where we're heading. So let me start on a surface and just set this up in case you want to talk about here's been my experience of my real self or my true self, whatever we mean by that. I'll start with Karen Horney, if I can find her here, because Claudio Naranjo liked her. And if you've ever read Karen Horney, she's really a wonderful writer. She talks about, they've got 4 selves. We've got the actual self, the person who you actually are, regardless of anybody's perceptions, including our own. Then you've got what she talks about as the real self, the core of our being, our potential, who we truly are. So that for her is our subjective view of our actual self. The despised self is the negative view of the self. Maybe we weren't loved unconditionally, but on condition that we are, one of the 9 ways of the Enneagram types. And so then we start to dislike our real self and form this ideal self. That's the idealized self-image. The self you think you should be so you can be loved. Carl Rogers also has a similar idea about this real self. So he talks about, I'm going to switch over to him now, the self-actualizing tendency. And it's in us, it's in plants, it's in animals. It's that tendency to be who we are, to be ourselves. He says it's the part of us that wants to expand, to extend, become autonomous, develop, mature, to activate all the capacities of our self, of our organism. And if we have the proper environment, that's going to happen naturally, automatically. Rogers he talks about a congruent self and an incongruent self. So the congruent self is that who I am, who I think I am, and who I show myself to be are all kind of coterminous, as opposed to I have a kind of a higher idea of myself, an inflated sense, doesn't quite fit the real me, or a deflated sense, I underestimate myself, or I know what an idiot I am, but I'm not going to show you that. So there's an incongruence. And he would say the healthy person, then those 3 come together, who I am, who I think I am, and who I express myself to be. So again, I think because I got nothing better to do, I'm going to write all this stuff up and I'll put it on my website or maybe on the 9 points on the Enneagram, or somehow get it out there so you can remember some of this stuff. Anyway, so when you think about, well, now what's my real self? Rogers talks about some characteristics of a fully functioning person. So see if this fits you when you're open to experience, as opposed to closed off, biased against Fox News as I am. I realize I'm not open to experience. Are you experiencing existential living? Are you in the here and now? Or are you like me, when I get there, then I'll be happy, as opposed to when I get here, then I'll be happy. Organismic trusting. Do you trust your own experience? That's what Rogers talks about. Even he says, I don't trust authority. I don't trust revelation. I don't trust, that's not I don't trust them. But above all those things, above logic, above reason, I put my experience. So you trust that. Freedom is another characteristic of the fully functioning person. So when have you experienced inner freedom, outer freedom? I think the Enneagram, part of its gift to us is helping us see how we are imprisoned, unfree in ourselves, and how we're kind of determined, conditioned by what other people expect of us. So when you are a fully functioning person, you are freer, inside and outside. Creative. I've been impressed these days by creativity. So you might think, When have you been creative in your life? Because that might be an expression of your real self. Internal locus of evaluation. So it's not what I should do, what other people are telling me to do, but what do I think is the right process, the thing to do. Are you willing to be a process? So we're growing, we're learning. That's why we're meeting today. Okay, so open to experience, living in the here and now. These things are going to be coming up. Trusting your own experience, your own organismic self-regulation, freedom, creativity, internal locus of evaluation. Okay. Maslow. So if you think that's a lot of stuff to remember. So Maslow is also into self-actualization. Who isn't? The top of his hierarchy. So these days we're probably more at the bottom of the hierarchy. How am I going to get enough groceries or more important, toilet paper? Or if I don't have any groceries, I won't need the toilet paper. All right, stay focused. Stay focused. So we're, safety, security, physical needs, but up the top, self-actualization. So what are those qualities? Which that might have something to do with our real self or our better self. So see if this works for you. Also knowing that he got these characteristics from just a few people, maybe, I don't know, a dozen or so. And there are a lot of, not surprisingly, academics, philosophers, men. There's a few women in there, but so it's a small sample of self-actualized people. So basically Abe and his friends. So characteristics, people who are self-actualizing, maybe your real self, perceive reality accurately and fully. So you see things as they are, not as you are, that old line. Or you see things not through the veil of personality, but through your essence, through your real self. So you see things as they are, not distorted. You have an acceptance of yourself. So, when was the last time you accepted yourself? Other people, nature. People who are self-actualized exhibit spontaneity. So maybe that's, think about a time when you've been spontaneous, not self-conscious. There's a simplicity about self-actualized people and a naturalness about them. So they're not phony. They're concerned with problems instead of themselves. So they're more task-oriented rather than ego-oriented. There's a certain quality of detachment and a need for privacy. Apparently, he interviewed some 5s for his study. They're autonomous. He probably knew some 8s. They exhibit a freshness of appreciation. So they're not jaded. Oh, there's a kind of a childlike innocence to them, appreciating things. They have peak experiences. Not all, but some do. So you might think about what were the peak experiences in your life? Things that were kind of outside of the ordinary, that you lost a sense of yourself, lost a sense of time. You were just taken up by this experience. A couple of them come to mind. One of them was a long time ago. As a 5, this appealed to me. It's almost impossible these days to find some place that's quiet, where there is no mechanical sound. You're in the desert, an airplane comes over. You're at the lake, a car or a boat goes by. You're in your backyard, somebody turns on a leaf blower. Years ago, I was in, where the hell was I? Austria. Up in the Alps, and I left the group I was with. I went over the top, over the other side, and it was perfectly quiet. I could actually hear the wind blowing in the grass. I could hear flies buzzing. It was a peak experience. There's another one I had, I think when my daughter was born. uh, my wife Bernie, she had to have a cesarean operation, so Mary Kate comes out, and I swear to God, she was looking around the room, casing the place, saying, "Well, where am I now?" And she's been nosy the rest of her life. It's amazing. It hasn't lost it at all. I realized that little babies can't see beyond mother's breast, but it looked like she was looking around the room. And yeah, and still experiences FOMO, fear of missing out. Well, am I missing anything here? No, you're not. Okay, peak experience. Can you identify with all of humankind? You have deep friendships with a few individuals. You have a democratic value, so equal opportunity, a liver, employer. You have an ethical sense. You have an unhostile sense of humor. You're creative, you resist enculturation. So you don't go along with the crowd, you're a conscientious objector. So you might think, okay, I'm just giving you ideas of where you might have experienced your real self. I'm going to switch over to the existentialists, who are really a depressing crowd. And so they're talking about being authentic rather than inauthentic. So the authentic person is in the moment. What else? They're unfolding their potential, and they're confronting the givens of existence. So here's where the fun comes in. So what are the four givens? Death, isolation, freedom, and meaninglessness. Great. Something that we all like to think about. So how are you being authentic in your thinking about your own death, thinking about death? The antidote to that is faith and choosing life, but we need to come to terms with the fact that we're born on our way to die. The isolation, man, these days we got to deal with that. And the kind of the I suppose it's brought home to us. Even people are dying alone. We think we do that anyway, even though we're with our loved ones. The death is it's something that we have to choose, that isolation. Not only would we choose it, but we're pushed into it. So isolation, and the antidote to that is relationships. So how are you fostering good relationships? Freedom. So are you acting responsibly with your freedom, or are you, as Eric Fromm talks about, escape from freedom, conformity, automaton behavior, going along with the crowd? And the last one is meaninglessness. So how do you create meaning in a meaningless universe? Or do we create meaning, or do we discover meaning? So when you've been real and authentic, have you been able to confront those four givens? And just one of the last thing, existential guilt is a sign that you're being authentic. So we live in these worlds, the Umwelt, which is the world around us. So are you taking care of nature or destroying it? We live with other people, the Mitwelt, so we're social creatures. So how are you fostering relationships with everybody? We live in our own world, the Eigenwelt. So is there a sense of integrity? Are you being true to yourself? And someone adds this Uberwelt, an overworld, so the spiritual world. So do you live up to these ideals that are in that world? All right, existentialism. So ideas about your real self. Winnicott, who is a British psychoanalyst and a pediatrician, actually talks about the false self and the real self. So the true self is the source of our spontaneous needs, our images, our gestures. The true self is honored or develops if the mother, the parenting figure, usually the mother, is there when the child has needs, so the parent is there and meets the child's needs. When the child doesn't have needs, when the child is just being quiet and still, and Winnicott talks about going on being, then leave the child alone. If that doesn't happen, then we have to accommodate to the environment, he says. So you've got to somehow do what the other person wants, either settle for whatever needs they are able to meet, or try to meet your own needs. So we develop this false self, which is it tries to take over the caretaking functions of the environment. And it tries to protect the integrity of the real self. But the real self then kind of goes into hiding. Now, lest all mothers in the world feel bad at this time, Winnicott also says the mother needs to fail in those areas for us to grow. Fail or not, you can't be as attentive to this little baby as you were in the first weeks of life. Gradually, you've got to go back and live the rest of your life. And so then the self has a chance to develop and grow. So a good enough parent is good enough for Winnicott. Okay. Okay, all right. Jung, individuation, self-psychology. Yeah. I got all this stuff, but I want to hear from you. Behaviorism doesn't really have a real self or a false self. We're just a conditioned self. So that makes a nice segue into, who are we before we got conditioned? So let me talk about Sandra Maitre a little bit and her theory, and getting it from A.H. Almas. The two of them were in Claudio's very first group, along with Bob Oakes, who taught me. And they have the diamond approach, which I don't know if some of you are familiar with. I've not done that. So again, I'm giving you the theory of this. So Sandra and Lorano talks about egoic existence and essential existence. So the ego is the conditioned self. The essence is who we were before we got conditioned. And she talks about living in our personality. We're now on the periphery of ourself, and as you go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, you get in touch with being, with a capital B. And so we come to realize that we are all expressions of being. So she says that the soul is a manifestation of our divine nature, being. Each of us is a unique arising of being. Being is what's left when all the constructs of the personality dissolve. It's likely, she says, that we are so wired so that we can consciously know being. This is with a capital B. So that we can know the divine as our nature. So rather than simply being the embodiment of and being made up of being, which is what all of manifest reality is, we have the opportunity to know ourselves as such. So we know ourselves to be the absolute, the divine itself. All right. And being is a state beyond veils, beyond boundaries. Ken Wilber has a book called No Boundaries. So when you go down and down and down and down into being, even beyond consciousness, you get in touch with the absolute. So this is tough for fives because we really like boundaries. I don't know that I want to say I am one with all. I'd rather be separate. That feels safer. I like me and you. I don't like we so much. So it's kind of hard for a 5, I think, to have that intuitive sense of being one with all that is. So we realize that we are a wave and we are part of the ocean. So so that's another question. Well, does that mean is this pantheism, or are we God, or are we like God, or do we participate in God? I'm not sure what that means. What's your experience? Not your thought, but have you had this experience of being one? So that's the kind of the boundaries dissolve, and you realize that that's an illusion. Reality is we are all one. So she talks about, Sandra talks about being, and the personality is kind of a sense of emptiness or deficiency because we've lost touch with being, and so there's like a hole in ourselves, an emptiness. Rather than run away from it, she suggests that you go into it, be there, present to it. A spaciousness occurs then, and being can arise out of that emptiness or nothingness. Have you ever had that experience? Okay, and lastly, and then I got to shut up. I'm talking way more than I want to talk here. David Benner, who is along the lines of Thomas Merton and Richard Rohr, talks that if we find our true self, we find God. If we find God, we find our most authentic self. So transformational knowledge is knowing of, not knowing about. Personal knowledge is based on experience, and both God and self are most fully known in relationship to each other. Nice. So knowing the invisible God, he says, might seem utterly impossible. It would be if it were not for the fact that it is something God desires more deeply than we could ever possibly imagine. So God longs to disclose to us. God can be known by human beings personally and experientially. This is the essence of eternal life. So he says, yeah, we can know God directly or experience God. You do it through love. So God's intention is that we experience God through love. I have a lot of quotes here about love, but transformational knowing of God comes from the intimate personal knowing of divine love. Because God is love, God can only be known through love. And we need to kind of surrender to that love or come to God as we are and have that experience that I am loved as I am, or God, in a way, God kind of sees God's self in us. There's a quote that the eye that we see God with is the same eye that God sees us with. So now we're back to no boundaries. God is known in community, and Benner is going to add, because he's a Christian, he brings Jesus in. So what's your experience of that? This is probably not going to work with Muslims or Buddhists or Hindus, although it might. But for him, Jesus is the true self who shows us by his life how to find ourself in relation to God. So the self we find hidden in Christ is our true self, because Christ is the source of our being and the ground of our true identity. What is that experience like? So our true self is the self that was created by God, being redeemed in Christ. It's the image of God that we are, the unique face of God has been set aside from eternity for you. We do not find our true self by seeking it, rather we find it by seeking God. It is by losing ourselves in God that we discover our true identity. There is no true life apart from relationship to God. Therefore, there can be no true self apart from this relationship. So, our vocation is grounded in the self that from eternity God has willed that we be. Our calling is to become that self and then to serve God and our fellow human beings in the particular ways that will represent the fulfillment of that self. Our identity is not simply a possession, it is a calling. Nice. So that's a lot. Again, I've got a lot more. I was just going to talk for 20 minutes, and here we are at the end. We can go longer. I ain't going anywhere today. I would really like to hear from you if you're willing to share whatever, what has been your experience of your psychological real self, or as you go down deeper, have you had that experience of finding yourself in God, finding God in yourself? What's that all about? And I would ask that we share that in all humility. It's not like, it's not a competition. Hey, I've had a deeper experience than you have. Let me tell you about it.
So
Yeah.
Jerry, I
Yeah.
think one of the gifts of all that you've given in this talk is that there are so many ways to see, and it does feel as though there might have been a word or a phrase that emerged for someone, maybe a quote or just one of those ways of seeing. For me, it was congruency. And I loved that word because with my mother's death, both my true self, my false self, my ego, and my essence have been at play.
Yeah.
And so, that is a reality that I find very hopeful, that in order to have a sense of being, it is not about, am I living completely in this true self moment? It's no, my personality got me up and I went straight over, even though, it was a COVID danger.
Yeah.
Because I had to move in and connect. And so that could have been shameful for me afterward to say, why did you do that? And I've been talking to shame throughout the days as well, especially as loved ones have said, why did you do that? Even though I went in with my N95, I want you all to know, and fully garbed. But I know both, I feel that congruency, that it was okay with God, that I didn't just function out of my true self when my mom died. I brought all of me in that little room with her. So I wonder about our friends here, how they've been noticing in these really intense times, how both true self and false self might be leading them to being. Because we've never been closer to ourselves than right now. Because we're stuck with ourselves,
No kidding. Yeah.
And, so that's.
And you're right. It's not an all or nothing. It's not like, well, now I'm my real self and that's it. No more false self, or now I'm my false self and no real self. It's a little bit of both. We go back and forth. Yeah. And a kind of that's part of the being healthy, the acceptance of that. Yeah. I'm not perfectly whole and integrated. Close, but not quite.
We see the halo.
Yes.
Yes. And I don't see anyone's hand raised. Teresa, is there someone that we can unmute?
Well, I've sent you some things there in the private chat that were earlier, so it was just easier to organize them.
Maybe Sybil? How about Sybil?
Yeah, Sybil had a comment there. Everybody can see the chat, but Sybil, you want to unmute and, or here, I can unmute you. There you go, friend.
Well, it seems to me, I'm very familiar with David Benner's book, and just did a retreat on it. And it seems to me that this aspect of desire to be our true selves, I think all of us on this are here because that's in us. And a question is how did that get in us? Because if we observe creation, I haven't seen a tulip trying to figure out how to be a daffodil. And I haven't seen a dog trying to figure out how to be a cat. There seems to be in all of creation a sense of being a true self, but it's not true with human beings. There's this longing that is in us, that there is something more. And what I just wrote, I put it out to everyone. One of the places that we see it, your phrase was God sees God's self in us. And I have seen this with parents who have welcomed a new baby into their lives. And when that baby comes out and the mother and father are looking at that baby, they're looking, do their hands look like mine? Are their eyebrows the same as mine? What do we think the color of their hair is? And then we go searching for our baby pictures to say, does it look like me? Does it look like you? Is it a combination? And it is beyond. It actually is I think an experientially divine moment, whether we're able to name it. And I'll say one last thing. Walter Wagner has this quote. He says, when all of us are born with the divine, and there are several that you spoke about who would affirm that. But he said, what happens, all of us began life with the divine dance. But what happened is no one helped us name the experience. And it got lost along with our lisps. So,
or I think it's Sandra in one of her books, talks about that we're kind of taught to look outside, look out and develop this personality, and we don't get much encouragement to look in. So it's kind of a similar idea. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would say, I have been deeply influenced and started a research center to do the work of Sophia Cavalletti. And I don't know if you know of her, and even Maria Montessori, but this essence of believing that the shalom, the shalem, the integral, if you want to call it congruence, is born inside a child. They carry it.
Yeah.
And so I would even say a part of my work in spiritual direction is helping someone uncover that shalom that is already there and that has been covered over just by the aspect of living life.
Yeah, it's not like we have to create it. It's there. We just forgot it's there. It's kind of platonic. Now, let me ask you this. Have you had that experience of getting in touch with that part of you?
Absolutely. Yes, I have had that experience. And it's so interesting. I had an experience in this social distancing of myself, of being some feet away from a great grandchild who has been told to socially distance.
Yeah.
And so he has stood back, and normally he would run and envelop me.
Yeah.
And he had this look in his eyes that was pensive, that was had probably a little bit of fear. He would never have been able to name it. And I said that it triggered. That was me when I came over to this country from Germany after World War II. There I have a picture of the pensive, deep-seated look in my eyes. And then I have a picture of myself 1 year later. And there is light and life in my eyes because my grandmother took me to the church and the people in the church loved me. And I knew that God was there, and I have seen it, you know. And anyway, my love affair with the people of God and the body of Christ has never gone away. I've certainly been
Yeah.
saddened sometimes, but it has stayed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the David Benner and Richard Rohr in his latest book too on the Trinity. You know, that we find God not alone, but in community, because God is a community.
Yes.
Yeah. However that works with three persons, but yeah.
I wonder if this question about, you know, when have we experienced it? Could we in the chat bar, could you just put a word or a phrase that lets us know how you have experienced it? I think about the words that you just kept about self-actualization, about feeling life, about feeling creative, times when you accepted yourself. I just wonder if you could in the chat bar just say that little, even if it was a glimmer of a moment where you were in touch with being, you were in touch with the truest thing about you. And maybe someone else can talk for a minute or two. We are planning to go a little bit longer today, and those that need to leave can leave, but I don't want you to leave without letting us hear from you in some way or another. Where have you sensed being? Where have you sensed God? Where have you sensed your true self? And I do want to tell you, for those that will be leaving us, that next month we'll be with Beatrice Chestnut. B is going to be with us for Midday Cafe next month, which will be the third Wednesday of the month. And I think it's March 20th, isn't it, Erica? And we just forgot last week. I got to tell you, friends, our whole board forgot what day it was, and we missed last month's call. And so, but we will be back to the third Wednesday next month. But we would really love to hear just a word or a phrase from you when you experience the ground of your being, the essence, the true self, I see even words
Claire,
like
I have
Claire.
here.
Yeah. Diane.
yes, Diane.
Yeah, this is Diana. Was as a little kid, I don't know, I would say around 3 or 4 years old. I remember the bed upstairs that I had to go to because my little brother was going to be born or took over the crib or something. And I had nights after my mother would put me to bed where I looked forward to closing my eyes and I could see white. I experienced purity in whiteness, and I knew that was God. Somehow I just knew that was God. And yeah, so that was a very early mystical experience I had as a child. And then, of course, eventually that went away and I couldn't do that anymore.
Is there a way that the people are putting their phrases up? Can we save those?
Yeah, absolutely can. Yeah.
Oh, great. Because I'd like to write them all up and put them together. That's great.
Yeah, we have unconditional love and being known by others and connected to God and nature and seen. Yeah, beautiful. And you know, I wonder if you could talk about one thing, Jerry, even because I'm noticing I'm a pastor and a spiritual director, so I have a lot of spiritual language, as you know, that I access. And there is a term called spiritual bypass. And sometimes when we're not doing our own good psychological work, we have this we let go of the good psychological work and name it as God, rather than letting all things belong. You know, the idea that my mom used to say, there's so much good in the worst of us and so much bad in the best of us, that it hardly pays any of us to talk about the rest of us. And there was this, she was trying to include both the false self and the true self, the essence and the ego structures, and say, you know, don't In fact, when I first was converted in my 20s in the Catholic charismatic movement, both my mom and dad were very concerned that I was letting go of some other things I may have learned about God through literature and art and
right.
music and those things. And so many times we can have this spiritual bypass where we don't say, okay, so this anxiety right now is a gift to remind me that I have a need, and that I can bring that need to to God. I can bring it to a competent professional. In fact, I bet you have a lot of appointments right now based on our own anxieties at home. So can you just say something about spiritual bypass, or tell me no way, it doesn't have anything to do with what I want to talk about? You get to choose.
I think the latter is, it doesn't quite fit what I was talking about. I mean, the only thing I can think of is what what other folks have said. We go through these kind of stages of development.
No.
We go through the stages of development, and they're kind of invariant. Like you can't skip over one, or you got to go back and do that step. So maybe spiritual bypassing is, I don't know. It's the McDonald's of the spiritual world. We want to do it quickly, as opposed to, no, you got to do it gradually and step by step. Or it's you want to avoid the pain of having to go through your psychological shadow. Yeah, I
Well, maybe this question would be helpful if you can help me find it again, Teresa, about shadow boxing. Someone wanted to know about shadow boxing. Does that have anything to do with congruence with true self, false self?
I don't know what shadow boxing is.
Oh, well, that came from, can you unmute that person for us, Erica?
I'm unmuted.
There you go. Can you ask that question, Lynn?
Yeah. Rohr in his books talks so much about shadow boxing as part of the experience of finding your true self. And I understand that that's a Jungian concept, and Rohr is frustratingly shy on details about practically what does that mean to shadow box. I understand that that's talking to your false self and saying, no, that is an ego need. Let's go a little deeper. But other than that, I don't practically understand how to shadow box as a way of not erasing the ego, because we do need our ego, but at least telling the ego, sit in the passenger seat, sit in the back seat, allow the true self to drive.
Yeah. I haven't seen that in Richard's stuff in his books. When I think of the shadow, it's like I'm making friends with the shadow, and what's there that we're not seeing. So everything belongs, kind of thing.
He talks about it a lot in Falling Upward, which is the book of his that I have read at least a half dozen times, but it's in passing. So again, no practical understanding of what does it mean to shadow box in order to eventually, yes, make the ego your friend. And like you said earlier in the conversation of, we need the ego. We don't always need to go deep when we're trying to figure out what we're going to eat for dinner. There is a practical side to having the ego play a part within our lives, but not allowing it to have the power that it has when we are in our less developed states.
Yeah.
Yes, I have a thought that I'm trying to suppress, but it's coming out. It's like certain people who say, I have absolute power. I will determine what happens here. As opposed to, well, there's the Congress, there are governors, there are states, there are this, there are that. it's like the ego needs to be humble, which is hard for our ego to do. And as Jung says, there is this larger self that includes the unconscious, all these archetypes. We've got the whole wisdom of the human race that we've inherited. Our ego has just got, 50 years of experience. It thinks it's great, but it's kind of limited. So to humbly say, let me allow all that it's a part of me to come into the picture. And I suppose now if you get into going deeper and deeper and deeper, well, all of you could be being, could be God, could be, there is no boundary. Ego is pretty boundaried. My ego likes boundaries, so I don't know.
Well,
Ask me that question 5 years from now.
Okay, you'll think about it and write a book.
Yeah, that's right.
Even as I'm looking at the ways people have experienced being and presence, they are varied, they are unique, but they are also many of the things that you talked about. We've got people talking about the simplicity of the ordinary moment, and people that have had this these kind of ecstatic experiences of white light.
Yeah.
And you referred to death. I just want to say to all of us that we do have a time of opportunity and great suffering for us to experience things we've not paid attention to before. And I feel like even having this on record on YouTube, we can go back and say, well, when was the last time I had some creative play, or held a newborn baby, or went out and listened beyond the buzz of machinery in a place where all I could hear were birds or crickets. And it seems to me that may give us ways to return. And this is not original to me, but we always say practice makes permanent. And if we find those things that enliven us to being, to presence, right, we can practice them, and they create new neural pathways, new ruts and grooves in our brain that we remember, okay, this is where I can be fully myself. And this is where I'm really beside myself. I'm not feeling like I'm living in a way that is whole. So I'm really grateful to hear these gifts from people. And I don't know if you have any more time, and if you do, if there is a raised hand for, and otherwise we will just say goodbye. But if you have time, we'll answer a raised hand.
Or not so much answer questions as does someone have an experience that they could share? So like we're doing with the words and phrases.
Yes.
So that's what we're talking about.
That's
with
what
this
we're
real
talking
self.
about.
Yeah.
Let's have an experience here. So Leanne, I'll unmute you if you have an experience that you want to talk about. Erica, can you do that?
Hi there. Thanks, Jerry, for just your really honest processing here today with us. My experience that I want to share kind of connects with what Christian Wiman talks about in his Bright Abyss. He names God as the awakened creativity of every moment, and that has sunk deep into me. And so in the last few years, I've started just experimenting with prayer and color. And one particular time, I was feeling just a whole flood of emotions. And so I just took chalk pastels, and I'm not an artist, so this is not pretty. Like, this is just color on pages. And I just started throwing in like just all of this red in the middle, because that felt like pain for me. And so it was balls of red. And then it felt like I needed to like throw in orange, and because I was feeling anxious, and green from the top because that was fear. And it was just a mob of color. that was just truly expressing what felt honest for me. And as a 2 on the Enneagram, I've just recognized how often I don't naturally let myself be honest with those real feelings.
Yeah.
And so as I was throwing in the color, then I felt like I just needed to cry. And so then it needed to be washes of blue, like coming down from the top, bathing all of the red. And so really I have a page that's kind of like a mess. And I sat there, but I felt profoundly consoled in just having that expression of color.
Yeah.
And then as part of a regular practice that I tend to do is I have a Christian Seasons calendar, and it has the lectionary readings that are set out for every week. And so I just happened to say, well, what are the lectionary readings for this week? And so I opened my Bible to the first one, which happened to be the story of Elisha and his contest with the Baals, like the others who were worshiping Baal. And it's like, whose God is the biggest and the best? And in a moment, like it was just this hair drop of a moment, right? Where all of a sudden I read, and I'm not going to get like the phrasing perfectly here, but the verse that jumped out to me is, if you want to trust in Baal, trust in him. But if you want to trust in God, then trust in God. And all of the rage and all of the fear and all of the things that I had been processing had everything to do with me not really wanting to trust God, like really wanting to find all these other sources of trust. Yeah. And in that moment, I would like felt it like a pierce in my heart. And then I looked at my picture, and my picture was, no word of a lie, the exact representation of that scene. I had water coming from the sky, which was like the whole thing about water in the passage. I had like all of my red that was there ended up looking like fire. And so here, like there had been this call for fire, or from fire from heaven, and then all the altars had been drenched in water. And here I had fire and water. And it was like my picture matched exactly what was going on with what came to me in the lectionary that day. And it was profoundly consoling. Like that was this moment of like, oh, this is where God met me. So that's just my little tale.
That's great. Jung would love it. That synchronicity and all those archetypes in there. That's great. Yeah. We're not as different and separate as we'd like to think we are. Yep. Yeah. Thanks, Leanne.
Yeah, Leanne. I mean, that's just vivid, and your very own. Beautiful.
Well, should we kind of go back to our caves and get back in touch with our deepest selves and see what God has to say, or our authentic self has to say to us?
Well, I'm so grateful for time to be with you, and I do think that times of great suffering and times of at times of beauty really do give us a way to touch into what is most true. And I think about I just think about the stories that the people on this page that I know have. I even sent a couple of behind the wall things saying, I remember when this happened for you. And when our son died, my husband and I both heard bells, audible bells, and we didn't know where they were coming from. And we went through the house looking for the bells, couldn't find the source of the bells, and then thought, well, what do we do now? Like, we're hearing bells. And so we looked in sacred texts, like, what's the meaning of bells? What could it be? And the only thing we could find is where the high priest had bells on the bottom of the garment when they went into the Holy of Holies. And so we were kind of just stuck there, like, oh my gosh, are we in the presence of the high priest? And we were struck, just wordless. And many years later, we were on a pilgrimage in Orvieto and Assisi, and we went in Assisi. There was an image of St. Clare, a sculpture of her, and I, I've always been drawn to her. I don't know why, and I was there, and when we were standing there, we looked over, and there was Aaron, the high priest, with these bells on the bottom of his gown.
Yeah.
Scott, I thought Scott was going to pass out in that church. You couldn't pry him away from that image.
Yeah.
And so, sights and sounds, things that you can't put together for yourself, things that you couldn't concoct, things that just the beauty of choosing to see God in the ordinary and the extraordinary. I think you've given us this beautiful list, everyone, that I think we can all go on like true self sightings and follow these footsteps to help us connect with what is life-giving. And Jerry, you have been life-giving for us today, our dear teacher and friend. And for those that are still here and those that will be on the recording later, if you haven't heard Jerry's interview with Chris Hewerts on Map Makers, he talks about how the test that he developed has the validity that it does for people who ask about testing, and why so many of Jerry's students utilize his inventory. You're going to want to hear the reasoning behind that. It's on recording, and if you've never utilized the inventory in your practices, we just invite you to take a look at that. It's the Enneagram Map Makers with Chris Hewerts, and it's weps.com, Wagner Enneagram Personality Style Scales, WEPSS.com, and all your books are at Spectrum, EnneagramSpectrum.com. All of your articles, the one you're going to write about all of us and all the things we said in the chat bar, is probably coming soon.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right.
Any final words?
Well, just as we say in Chicago, wash early, wash often. Take care of yourselves. Stay well. Yeah.
And stay off WebMD.
Yes. Okay.
Peace be with you, friends.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.